Benjamin Edward Britten was born on November 22, 1913, the youngest of 4 children in a middle-class family from Lowestoft, Suffolk, England. His father was a dentist, and his mother was a pianist and singer. From a young age, his musical talents were apparent, and though his father, on one hand, was not a very strong encourager of Benjamin's abilities, his mother was a dominant force in his musical life, to the point of being controlling. She was determined that he would be a success, and in many ways, she became the center of his world. He took both piano and viola lessons throughout his early childhood. It was through his viola teacher that he connected with composer Frank Bridge, the man who would have possibly the greatest impact on Britten's composition as his teacher. At age 14, Britten already had around 100 finished compositions to his credits. This included several works that had been published and performed. This so impressed Bridge that he persuaded Britten's parents to let Benjamin travel to London to study with him in the art of composition. Bridge's main teachings were that you should find yourself and be true to what you found. This was an idea that Britten latched onto and struggled to live out, both in his composition and personal life. In September 1928, Britten started attending Gresham's Public School at Holt in North Norfolk, England. His time there was a difficult and unpleasant one. The music master at the school disliked Britten's compositional voice, and the harsh student environment around school angered him. Though Britten himself didn't get into many scruffs with the other students, he saw many of his fellow students getting bullied, and that upset him due to his strong sense of justice and fairness. He sent many letters to his parents asking that he would be allowed to leave the school. His diary confessed that he at times was so low he contemplated suicide. After 2 years there, he graduated unexpectedly and was able to leave. The next stop was the Royal Conservatory of Music. Here, he studied composition under John Ireland, though Bridge really remained more influential. At the end of his second year, Britten won the Cobbett Chamber Music Prize for his Fantasy in F minor for string quintet. This piece truly showed the pulling influences of both Ireland and Bridge. He graduated from the Royal Conservatory of Music in December 1932. Benjamin began job hunting as soon as he got out, and in May 1935, he was employed under Albert Cavalcanti in John Grierson's General Post Office Film Unit. This period was very important for Britten, as it forced him to produce large quantities of music in a short amount of time, and it required that he make use of sound effects and match sounds to the film. The biggest impact of this employment, though, was the entrance it allowed him into an artistic circle of his own. This time marked the young Britten's awakening, politically and personally. A large portion of his new friend group was openly gay, at least with each other, and he was no exception. When his mother died unexpectedly in January 1937, Britten was both devastated and greatly relieved, as the shackles of her control fell from his arms. An immediate response for Britten was to dive into those sexual feelings he had long been repressing. On March 6th, through a chance meeting due to a mutual friend, Britten was introduced to Peter Piers, a tenor, who would end up being his life partner. On a side note, this time also brought up an admiration for childhood and youth, sexually and otherwise. He had a dalliance with a just 18-year-old boy, and feelings for a child much younger than that as well, but nothing occurred in the second case. This interest formed a lasting impression on Britten's music, as the themes of innocence and youth can be seen time and time again in his works. Britten left his home of England for new prospects in America in 1939. Peter Pears traveled with him, and this was when their relationship beyond friendship began. The years 1939 to 1942 were extremely prolific for Britten. In October of that year, Britten finished his work entitled Les Illuminations, which some called a fuller and more complicated picture of homoeroticism. The work shows contrasts of confusion and exhilaration, which is emphasized by the dual tonalities of E and B flat tritones. Overall, Britten's time in America allowed him to mature in self-confidence of who he was as a composer and person, including his sexual orientation. He was determined that if he was to return to Britain, it would be with the goal of becoming the central figure of classical music in England. At the time, Ralph vaughan Williams was the preeminent composer of Britain, and Benjamin's challenge upon returning in April 1942 was not to match him, but to contribute something new and powerful to Britain's musical life. Therefore, Britten found himself in a compositional lull until 1945, when he released Peter Grimes, perhaps his most celebrated and recognized work. Peter Grimes is the story of a fisherman, outcast from society, who becomes suspect in the disappearance of his young apprentice. Ironically, Grimes is not a sympathetic character, though rebuked and hated by the townsfolk. In the end, he sails out and drowns himself. The audience is intended to see themselves in the townsfolk, driving away this outcast man, and ultimately leading him to suicide. It can be understood that Britten wrote this as a parallel for homosexuality. After that, Britten went on to compose several more operas, like The Rape of Lucrezia, Albert Herring, and Billy Budd. Around 1946, Britten and his colleagues founded the English Opera Group. Feeling as though he might be getting stuck in a rut, Britten began to travel in search of new sounds and colors for his works. From November 1955 to March of the following year, Britten went on an extensive tour with Peter Pears to various parts of the world, most of the times, though, in Asia. He was particularly fascinated by the music of the Javanese gamelan. In trying to incorporate those sounds into his music, Britten wrote, "At last, I'm beginning to catch on to the technique, but it's about as complicated as Schoenberg." In 1958, Britten was commissioned to compose a choral work, which would celebrate the consecration of a brand new cathedral at Coventry. The War Requiem was created in 1961 as a result, and it is truly the pinnacle of all his output. Again, many of the same themes from Britten's life appeared even in this piece. Pacifism is the driving force behind the work, and the text was taken from the poetry of Wilfred Owen, a young homosexual soldier who died in World War I. In the rest of his years, Britten continued to travel and compose. He received many awards and honors throughout his life in recognition of all his works. The highest honor that he received was Life Peerage in 1976. After many years of declining health, Benjamin Britten passed away in the arms of Peter Pears on December 4th, 1976. Benjamin Britten was a man tormented in his youth, and evidently throughout his life. Yet in spite of that, he was an artist of true brilliance. He single-handedly restored and polished English opera, and he was well known for his choral works. If there is something to be learned from his life, it is this: the words of his teacher, Frank Bridge. Find yourself, and be true to what you've found.
Ma io sol quel che proprio è simile, ne trago come cor nel viso nostro. Mi semina sospir, lacrime dolle, umor d'arceverezze, e questo no. vari sedi, vario si converte.